Chapter 3. Sundar was just 16. He had no money, no possessions. His relations were hostile, his friends few. No family eagerly planned his future, advising and encouraging him. It was a harsh beginning for any enterprise. Yet he was joyful and eager. Sundar knew what God had called him to do. The preliminaries were over. He had withstood many pressures, and he knew that he had only done so by the power of God working in him. The Lord had shepherded him through each rebuff, had strengthened him in temptation, and delivered him from certain death. Having publicly witnessed to his faith by receiving baptism, Sundar was eager to serve the God who had brought him thus far. 33 days after his baptism, he left Sadhu. He was dressed in a plain robe of saffron cotton and a turban, both traditional garments of an Indian sadhu. His mother's ambition for him was fulfilled. The little boy who had stood beside her under the trees and recited the Bhagavad Gita to the Hindu holy man now gave his life to the service of God as a sadhu. That he did so as a Christian would not, he knew, have distressed his mother. She alone of his family would have understood his experience of Christ, and she alone would have recognized the compulsion of his vocation. There is no doubt that her influence on him had been strong, and her example and her wishes were as important as his new faith in setting him on his chosen road. He was later to say he had attended the best theological college in the world, his mother's bosom. Years later, in 1920, Sadhu Sundar Singh visited England and met the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Randall Davidson. In their discussions, Sundar spoke warmly of his mother's gentle upbringing and how he learned from her the love of the Lord. "If I do not see my mother in heaven, I shall ask God to send me to hell so that I may be with her," he told the Archbishop. To appreciate what Sundar Singh was trying to do as a Christian sadhu, it is necessary to understand the place of the sadhu in the religious life of India. C. F. Andrews, a missionary of long experience in India, wrote, "India, perhaps more than any other country in the world, has felt in her soul this thirst for the living God. No one who has watched the long line of pilgrims on their way to some sacred shrine can ever forget the mystery of this heart longing to seek and find God's presence." Many men in India devote their lives to this quest. Some, called sadhus, spend all their days in God's service. Sannyasis, on the other hand, take up the life after a secular career. Both wear the yellow robe and have no settled home or money. They are dependent on others for food. There were many at that time whose lives were a credit to the sadhu concept, but there were some who disgraced the ideal or used it merely as an excuse to beg. Spectacular self-mortification, such as lying on a bed of nails or refusal to wash, seemed to Western minds unproductive exercises. Such practices, though common, were by no means universal amongst sadhus. Frequently the life of the sadhu expressed the highest and best in Hindu spirituality. Then he said to them, "Go forth to every part of the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation." St. Mark 16:15, New English Bible. He said to them, "The crop is heavy, but laborers are scarce. You must therefore beg the owner to send laborers to harvest his crop. Be on your way. And look, I am sending you like lambs among wolves. Carry no purse or pack, and travel barefoot. Exchange no greetings on the road." St. Luke 10:2-4, New English Bible. His mother's teaching in the Hindu and Sikh faiths on the one hand, and the words of Jesus Christ on the other, these two lines of thought converged like an arrow in Sundar Singh and set him on his way. Jesus had told his followers to tell the good news to all the world. Sundar Singh obeyed. He followed the command quite simply, quite literally. He took no money, no shoes. He had two possessions, a blanket and his Urdu New Testament. Since his first acquaintance with Christians, one thing in particular had troubled Sundar. They were so un-Indian. They wore Western clothes, they sang Western hymns, they brought not only the Christianity of the New Testament, but also the whole paraphernalia of Western religious culture as well. Sundar Singh had been reared outside that culture. This enabled him to distinguish between the essential message of the New Testament, timeless and universal, and the packaging, largely Victorian and European, in which it was being offered to the Indian people. Throughout his life, Sundar sought to proclaim the gospel with an authentic Indian accent and not in tones and cadences imported from abroad. This was the predicament that faced, and still faces, the Indian church, as indeed it does churches in Africa, China, or New Guinea. Sundar Singh instinctively perceived the dilemma and it was for this reason he did not join the missionaries at Savathu, but set out on his own. A story that Sundar often told illustrates his purpose. He was once on a train returning to North India from Bombay. At a stop along the line, he saw through a window a Brahmin priest, being helped by his friends out of the train, having been overwhelmed by the heat. The station master hurried towards the fainting figure with a cup of water. The Brahmin, though desperately in need, refused the water. According to the rules of his religion, he would pollute himself if he drank from anything but his own brass drinking vessel. "I will not break my caste," he said. "I am willing to die." One of his companions fetched his own cup. The water was poured into it, and he drank gladly. "It is the same with the water of life," explained Sundar. "Indians do need the water of life, but not in a European cup." Thus it was that on the 6th of October, 1905, a tall upright figure in a flowing saffron robe left Savathu. His dark hair was hidden in a turban similar to the one he had worn as a Sikh. He saw no reason to abandon his Indian form of dress in favor of Western style. His beard grew freely, his eyes shone bright and dark against his pale brown complexion. He was a young man in his prime, compelling in his bearing and appearance. He went barefoot and without luggage. He would eat what he was given, but he would not beg. He would rest where he was offered shelter. If necessary, he would sleep in the open. He began his preaching tour in the country around Simla, going from village to village and delivering his message. It was hard going. Warm welcomes turned into bitter hostility, when his listeners realized that it was the Christians' God he spoke of. His bare feet were often cut and scratched. This was mountain country, and the nights were cold. A day's hard climbing from one village to another would end, with doors being barred and a night spent shivering and hungry in the open. It was a great contrast to the life he had known as a boy. All this time, Sundar knew he was getting nearer to his hometown of Rampur. The compulsion to return grew stronger. His motives for wishing to visit Rampur so soon after his departure can only be matter for conjecture. Perhaps it was desire to take the fight to the enemy camp. Perhaps no more than wistful curiosity. At a village only 2 miles from Rampur, Sundar spent the day talking to the people. As it grew dark, the villagers went to their homes. He found himself alone. Weary, he lay down under a tree and tried to forget that he had eaten nothing that day. Should he seek out one of his listeners and ask for food? No, he had vowed never to beg. His thoughts turned to his home, less than an hour's walk away. At home he had never known hunger, never been cold. He checked his thoughts, for he could see only too clearly the direction. Suddenly his whole being was suffused by a sensation of peace and joy, and the tempting thoughts retreated. This was to happen to Sundar many times in his life. The more he endured and the greater his suffering, the more positively did he feel Christ's presence. So happy was he as he sat, hungry and tired, under the tree, that he burst out singing and continued rejoicing until midnight. His voice echoed through the village. The people listened and crept out to see what he was doing. Perhaps he was drunk? 2 of them approached the tree and looked at him curiously. He was not drunk, but he seemed radiantly happy. Sundar realized that his joyful outburst had been louder than he intended. He told his visitors why it was that he sang. "Forgive us," they said, when he explained about his hunger. "We never thought. We will get you food at once." Sundar ate the food gratefully, thanked God for his care, and lay down under his blanket. In no time, he was asleep. The next day, as the light came, he made his way to Rampur. He went, not to seek admission to his father's home, with its food and shelter, but to tell the people of Rampur of the power and sustaining love of Jesus Christ. A few months before, he had been despised by the whole village, yet he found to his surprise a good audience amongst the shopkeepers and farm workers of Rampur. At last he seemed to be accepted by them. That evening, encouraged by his success, he made his way to his father's house. Even if he did not seek the comforts of his former home, he did hope for his father's blessing and understanding. At first, his father refused to see him. Sundar sent a second request to his father, and was overjoyed when he caught sight of his father walking towards him. "Very well, Sundar. You can stay here tonight, but you must leave early in the morning. After that, I do not wish to see you again." Sundar quietly joined his family, but he knew he was only barely tolerated. At the meal, his father indicated that he should sit apart from the rest of them. He was afraid that his son might pollute the food or drinking vessels by his presence. It was painful for Sundar to be denied a place at his father's table, and he felt the tears rising. He struggled to suppress them. Reluctantly, they served him with some food. His father then approached him bearing a pitcher of water. To Sundar's distress, he saw his father lift the vessel high and pour the water into his son's hands from a great distance. Sundar could keep back his tears no longer. That is how high-caste Indians gave water to an untouchable or outcast, the lowest rank of Hindu society. Sundar rose to leave. "Father," he said, "it does not matter if you have forsaken me, because I have taken Christ for the love of him who gave his life for me, and his love is unchangeable, and is far greater than yours. Before I became a Christian, I dishonored Christ, but he did not forsake me. Now I do not complain. I thank you for your past love to me, and also for these past few hours under your roof." Sundar bade his father goodbye, and after a night in the open, he left Rampur the next morning. There are numerous stories that Sundar was later to relate concerning this period in his life. He kept no diary, and it is impossible to know the exact order in which the events occurred. His recollections do, however, give a vivid picture of the next 4 years when he went from village to village in North India, preaching and teaching. These few years can be regarded as an apprenticeship for his later work. His was essentially a ministry to individuals. He worked along person-to-person lines. Even the most casual encounter he regarded as an opportunity to evangelize. We may question, when we read of countless seemingly isolated incidents, why he did not choose to spend more time in one place, building up a firm Christian community. We wonder perhaps what became of his converts after his departure from the scene. There are 2 things to bear in mind. We should not conclude, on account of his individualistic approach, that Sundar discounted the value of establishing local Christian groups. He invariably sent those who wished to make a firm Christian commitment to the nearest mission, to be baptized and to receive further instruction, and thus to be supported during their ongoing Christian life. In military terms, he saw himself as the advance guard. Secondly, it was the more dramatic events of his life, the sudden conversions, the hair-raising escapes, and the appalling privations that his contemporaries chose to record. The more pedestrian aspects of his life and ministry, the day-to-day love and support which he extended without stint, these, not surprisingly, failed to make the headlines. Doubtless, whenever Sundar revisited a village, he would seek out his earlier converts and assure himself of their well-being. He himself would value the opportunity, whenever it occurred, of encouraging and sharing in the corporate life of a local Christian community. It is with these thoughts in mind that we should study the tales of his adventures in North India during the period from 1905 to 1909. He tells how he arrived at a village called Doliwala one evening, on the point of exhaustion. He had been traveling all day and was anxious to find food and shelter. As the darkness fell, so did the rain. Sundar walked down the main street. The people clustered around him with offers of hospitality, supposing him to be a Hindu sadhu. Sundar spoke of Jesus, and their greetings swiftly turned to threats. Wearily, he stumbled towards the outskirts of the village, with their abuse still ringing in his ears. The rain became heavier, and he was thankful to come across a derelict hut, which afforded at least some shelter. Soaked and shivering though he was, he thanked God that he had found a place to rest and was asleep within minutes. He awoke cold and stiff in the half-light of dawn. The sight of a black shadow lying close beside him on his blanket checked him as he was about to stretch his legs. He peered closer at the dark patch and recoiled in alarm. It was a huge black cobra that had settled down to sleep, enjoying the warmth of Sundar's body. Trying not to make a sudden or jerky movement, he edged himself gently away from the terrifying black coil, and then dashed out of the hut. The snake did not stir, but lay heavily on Sundar's blanket. Thinking of the chill nights ahead, Sundar knew that the blanket could be the difference between life and death. He crept back to the hut and eased the blanket from under its sinister weight. The black coil drowsily rearranged itself, but did nothing to prevent Sundar escaping with his blanket. God had saved him once again. Traveling one day in the area around Meerut, Sundar told his friend, Mr. Alfred Zahir, how he had met a poor shepherd, cradling an injured lamb in his arms. The shepherd was sitting on a pile of stones by the road, and Sundar came and sat beside him. The two fell into conversation. Despite his rough appearance, the shepherd spoke to Sundar in a strangely confident and compelling manner. He stressed how his lambs taught him humility and how their obedience to their master was a lesson for all mankind. He spoke with a rare insight for a peasant farm worker. Eventually the shepherd rose and wandered off, leaving Sundar still, sitting on the stones. 5 minutes later, Sundar followed, hoping to catch him up. He spotted the shepherd ahead, disappearing behind a clump of trees, and he hurried on to the place, but could see no sign of him. It was as if the shepherd had vanished into thin air. "I am at a loss to tell where he disappeared," Sundar recounted to his friend. "I have not the least doubt that this man was an angel of God, who had been sent for my instruction. For the words he spoke went home to my heart, and I learnt such a lesson on humility and meekness as I shall never forget in all my life." An angel? Sent by God? Or a wise shepherd of flesh and blood? No one can answer that question, but in one sense perhaps he was both. At Jalalabad, Sundar met with a hostile response, but he was getting used to that, and he did not feel unduly worried. The people were mostly Muslims, and he hardly expected a welcome. While he was resting after talking to a group of them, a man cautiously approached him. "You must go. There is a plot to kill you. They think you are a spy." His informant slipped away without another word. Sundar thought he'd better take the advice. He gathered up his blanket and walked out of the village to the bare scrub beyond. It was no place to sleep in, for it was infested with insects and exposed to cold winds, but Sundar had little choice. He rested as best he could, and in the morning he lit a fire to warm himself and dry his clothes. He saw a group of men approaching him, and as they got nearer he recognized them as the Muslims he had met the day before, and about whom he had been warned. He stood up and faced them. Were they so determined to kill him that they sought him here? The men stopped a little way from him and murmured amongst themselves. One of them came closer and knelt down in front of him. Sundar was astonished. The man begged Sundar's forgiveness. They had wanted to kill him, he told Sundar, if he wasn't already dead from exposure after the cold night. Now that they had seen him alive and well, they realized that he must be especially favored of God. If Sundar would come back to Jalalabad with them, they would give him food and shelter and listen to his preaching. Sundar stayed with them a week, and felt that here, at least, he had made some headway. A snake at Doliwala, a shepherd at Meerut, the Muslims at Jalalabad. 3 incidents out of many, but typical of Sundar Singh's experiences at that time. Danger from animals in that wild country was a constant part of his life, but always he came through safely. Often he was lonely and despondent, but always the Lord upheld him. Hostility was the common reaction to his words, but time and time again he was instrumental in bringing Christ alive for people, as he did for the villagers at Jalalabad. Why was it that a young man, barely 20 years old, with no formal theological education or expertise, could make such an impact, even in the most unpromising conditions? The answer lies partly in Sundar's personality and partly in his method of teaching. C.F. Andrews, who first met him during these years, later wrote of the impression Sundar Singh had made on him. He speaks of the wistful shyness that Sundar had to master at their first meeting. It is fascinating to read his description of Sundar's appearance at the time, for such descriptions are few and far between. His face had the look of childhood fresh upon it, in spite of the marks of pain which were there also. At first sight, however, it was not so much his face that attracted my attention as his marvelous eyes. They were luminous, like the darkly gleaming water of some pool in the forest, which a ray of sunlight has touched. While there was a shade of sorrow in them, there was also the light of joy and peace. In later years, the dignity of his presence deeply impressed me, but on that first occasion, I seemed to see nothing but those eyes of his, looking into my own and offering me his friendship. They seemed to tell me, without any formal words, how great a treasure his soul had found in Christ. This was part of the secret. His love of God and his knowledge of God's saving love for him seemed to shine out from his face. Again and again, throughout his life, people were to insist that being with him made them feel that they were in the very company of Christ. They were. Like Jesus Christ, he used parables in his teaching. The setting of his parables, again like Christ's, were drawn from the everyday life of his listeners and the sights and sounds of nature. This was an apt approach for his Indian audience, for it was one with which they were familiar, for Hindu teaching also employed a system of analogy. For instance, in elaborating the words of Jesus, "Ye are the salt of the earth," Sundar emphasized that a dry lump of salt cannot make rice palatable. It has to be dissolved. When dissolved, it disappears and loses its identity. It is only in the taste of the rice that we know that it has done its work. Thus must Christians give of themselves, lost to sight perhaps, but they will not be lost, for they will live in the lives of others. One major difference between Christianity and some branches of Hindu thought is the question of personal identity. To some Hindus, the ultimate aim of man was to lose his personal identity and be absorbed by God, and become part of God, a concept totally at variance with Christian belief. Sundar Singh likened a Christian's union with God to the way a bar of iron will become glowing red when placed in a furnace. It glows red because the fire penetrates it. Iron is not fire. Fire is not iron. So, Jesus can live in us and transform us, but we do not cease to be ourselves. Traveling amongst the Himalayan mountains, Sundar Singh became deeply attached to the region, its beauty and its challenge. Many of his parables are gleaned from his close and accurate knowledge of the area. The streams in the Himalayan mountains, he said, as they rush forth from the pure white snows, cut their own course. Each one has its own appointed path, which it follows down the mountainside. That rushing torrent of pure water from the heights is the true symbol of the Christian life as it comes direct from Christ himself. But when the same waters reach the plains, they carry the mud along with them, and their tributaries are diverted into channels by artificial means, forming irrigation canals. These too have their uses, but they depend on the streams which flow from the mountain heights for their perennial supply of fresh living water. In other words, he was saying that man-made irrigation, i.e. aspects of the institutional church, had value, yet nonetheless those channels were entirely dependent on flooding by the grace of the Spirit, if they were to function effectively. It was Sundar's practice to work and travel alone, but for a year he had a companion. In August 1906, he met an American layman, Samuel Stokes. Stokes had come to India to preach Christianity, but had not felt drawn to work with any of the recognized missionary societies. On meeting Sundar, he felt at once that the Sadhu's way of living was appropriate for India. He and Sundar decided to join forces and to travel and work together. Their first night was spent at Jammu, a town lying in the foothills of the Himalayas about 100 miles north of Lahore. They were offered neither food nor proper shelter, though eventually they were given permission to sleep in a filthy cowshed and were handed a loaf of stale bread. The cowshed was chilly and infested with bugs. They got no sleep that night, but remembering our Lord's birth in the Bethlehem stable, they spent the time praying together. The dominant factor in bringing Samuel Stokes to India and to the life of a homeless wanderer had been the example of St. Francis of Assisi. Thus, at a time when Sundar was still developing his ideal of the sadhu life, Stokes introduced another important element, the idea of service to a man going hand in hand with the service of God. Throughout his life, Sundar sought to unite his desire for solitude, the need to be alone with God, with his belief that in serving man, we also serve God. During this first preaching tour together, Sundar's health broke down. He had severe abdominal pains and ran a high temperature. Stokes became anxious for his friend. They were many miles from the nearest village, and Stokes was sure that Sundar would not be able to travel much farther. Sundar finally collapsed by the roadside, almost unconscious with pain. Stokes eased him into a more comfortable position. Sundar's eyes opened. "How are you?" inquired Stokes. A low voice answered, "I am very happy. How sweet it is to suffer for his sake." Stokes was in a dilemma. No one would pass by on that lonely path. He had to leave Sundar and find help. Fortunately, a European planter's house was only a few miles away. Stokes got help, and Sundar was carried there. The owner insisted they should both stay until Sundar was better. He was much impressed by these two young men, and their quiet, confident faith. As Sundar recovered, they had many discussions, and in time, the planter was converted. Sundar and Samuel made their way to the leper hospital at Sadhu, the place Sundar had stayed before his baptism. No doubt seeking to put their ideal into practice, they spent a month working amongst the lepers. Even during their rest periods, they remained with the patients. Despite the risk to their own health, they did not spare themselves in comforting the sick and dying. Shortly after this, Stokes returned to America, planning to recruit more men to join their work. Sundar Singh and Stokes were never again to work so closely together, even when Stokes did come back to India. Yet they both tried each summer to snatch a few weeks together, when it was their custom to take crippled children from the hospital up to a summer camp in the mountains.